This paper intends to use psychoanalysis to discover where and how the fascination of film is reinforced by pre-existing patterns of fascination already at work within the individual subject and the social formations that have molded him. It takes as starting point the way film reflects, reveals, and even plays on the straight, socially established interpretation of sexual difference, which controls image, erotic ways of looking, and spectacle. It is helpful to understand what the cinema has been and how its magic has worked in the past, while attempting a theory and a practice which will challenge the cinema of the past. Psychoanalytic theory is thus appropriated here as a political weapon, demonstrating the way the unconscious of patriarchal society has structured film form. The paradox of phallocentrism in all its manifestations is that it depends on the image of the castrated woman to give order and meaning to its world. An idea of woman stands as a linchpin to the system. It is her lack that produces the phallus as a symbolic presence. It is her desire to make good the lack that the phallus signifies. Recent writing and screen about psychoanalysis in the cinema has not sufficiently brought out the importance of the representation of the female form in a symbolic order in which, in the last resort, it speaks castration and nothing else. To summarize briefly, the function of women in forming the patriarchal unconscious is twofold. She first symbolizes the castration threat by her real present absence of a penis, and secondly thereby raises her child into the symbolic. Once this has been achieved, her meaning in the process is at an end. It does not last into the world of law and language except as memory, which oscillates between memory of maternal plenitude and memory of lack. Both are posited on nature, or on anatomy in Freud's famous phrase. Women's desire is subjected to her image as bearer of the bleeding wound. She can exist only in relation to castration and cannot transcend it. She turns her child into the signifier of her own desire to possess a penis, the condition, she imagines, of entry into the symbolic. Either she must gracefully give way to the word, the name of the father, and the law, or else struggle to keep her child down with her in the half-light of the imaginary. Woman then stands in patriarchal culture as signifier for the male other, bound by a symbolic order in which man can live out his fantasies and obsessions through linguistic command, by imposing them on the silent image of woman, still tied to her place as bearer of meaning, not maker of meaning. However self-conscious and ironic Hollywood managed to be, it always restricted itself to a formal mise-en-scène reflecting the dominant ideological concept of cinema. The alternative cinema provides a space for a cinema to be born which is radical in both a political and an aesthetic sense, and challenges the basic assumptions of the mainstream film. This is not to reject the latter moralistically, but to highlight the ways in which its formal preoccupations reflect the physical obsessions of the society which it produced, and, further, to stress that the alternative cinema must start specifically by reacting against these obsessions and assumptions. A politically and aesthetically avant-garde cinema is now possible, but it can only exist as a counterpoint. The magic of Hollywood style at its best, and of all the cinema which fell within a sphere of influence, arose, not exclusively, but in one important aspect, from its skilled and satisfying manipulation of visual pleasure. This article will discuss the interweaving of that erotic pleasure in the film, its meaning, and in particular the central place of the image of woman. It is said that analyzing pleasure or beauty destroys it. That is the intention of this article. The satisfaction and reinforcement of the ego that represent the high point of film hitherto must be attacked. Not in favor of a reconstructed new pleasure, which cannot exist in the abstract, nor of an intellectualized unpleasure, but to make way for a total negation of the ease and plenitude of the narrative fiction film. The alternative is the thrill that comes from leaving the past behind without rejecting it, transcending outworn or oppressive forms, or daring to break with normal pleasurable expectations in order to conceive a new language of desire. The cinema offers a number of possible pleasures. One is scopophilia. There are circumstances in which looking itself is a source of pleasure, just as, in the reverse formation, there is pleasure in being looked at. Originally, in his 3 essays on sexuality, Freud isolated scopophilia as one of the component instincts of sexuality, which exist as drives quite independently of the erotogenic zones. At this point, he associated scopophilia with taking other people as objects, subjecting them to a controlling and curious gaze. His particular examples center around the voyeuristic activities of children, their desire to see and make sure of the private and the forbidden, curiosity of other people's genital and bodily functions, about the presence or absence of the penis, and retrospectively about the primal scene. In this analysis, scopophilia is essentially active. Although the instinct is modified by other factors, in particular the construction of the ego, it continues to exist as the erotic basis for pleasure in looking at another person as object. In the extreme, it can become fixated into a perversion, producing obsessive voyeurs and peeping toms, whose only sexual satisfaction can come from watching, in an active, controlling sense, an objectified other. At first glance, the cinema would seem to be remote from the undercover world of the surreptitious observation of an unknowing and unwilling victim. What is seen of the screen is so manifestly shown, but the mass of mainstream film and the conventions within it, which has consciously evolved, portray a hermetically sealed world which unwinds magically, indifferent to the presence of the audience, producing for them a sense of separation and playing on their voyeuristic fantasy. Moreover, the extreme contrast between the darkness in the auditorium, which also isolates the spectators from one another, and the brilliance of the shifting patterns of light and shade on the screen helps to promote the illusion of voyeuristic separation. Although the film is really being shown, is there to be seen, conditions of screening and narrative conventions give the spectator an illusion of looking in on a private world. Among other things, the position of the spectators in the cinema is blatantly one of repression of their exhibitionism and projection of their repressed desire onto the performer. The cinema satisfies a primordial wish for pleasurable looking, but it also goes further, developing scopophilia in its narcissistic aspect. The conventions of mainstream film focus attention on the human form. Scale, space, stories are all anthropomorphic. Here, curiosity and the wish to look intermingle with a fascination with likeness and recognition. The human face, the human body, the relationship between the human form and its surroundings, the visible presence of the person in the world. Jacques Lacan has described how the moment when a child recognizes its own image in the mirror is crucial for the constitution of the ego. Several aspects of this analysis are relevant here. The mirror phase occurs at a time when the child's physical ambitions outstrip his motor capacity, with the result that his recognition of himself is joyous and that he imagines his mirror image to be more complete, more perfect than he experiences his own body. In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female form, which is styled accordingly. In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact so that they can be said to connote to be looked atness. Women displayed as sexual object is the leitmotif of erotic spectacle. From pinups to striptease, from Ziegfeld to Busby Berkeley, she holds the look, plays, and signifies male desire. Mainstream film neatly combines spectacle and narrative. Note, however, how the musical song and dance numbers break the flow of the diegesis. The presence of women is an indispensable element of spectacle in the normal narrative film, yet her visual presence tends to work against the development of a storyline to freeze the flow of action in moments of erotic contemplation. This alien presence, then, has to be integrated into cohesion within the narrative. As Bud Boetticher has put it, what counts is what the heroine provokes, or rather what she represents. This is one, or rather the love or fear she inspires in the hero, or else the concern he feels for her, who makes him act the way he does. In herself, the woman has not the slightest importance.
Hey, let me out. Let me out!
Another few seconds and it would have been too late, Superman.
Well, it wasn't, Miss Lay, and that's what counts. What time is it?
Just about 12:30.
Well, I can't wait for the police. I have an appointment date. Excuse me.
An active-passive heterosexual division of labor has similarly controlled narrative structure. According to the principles of the ruling ideology and the physical structures that back it up, the male figure cannot bear the burden of sexual objectification. Man is reluctant to gaze at his exhibitionist-like. Hence, the split between spectacle and narrative supports the man's role as the active one of forwarding the story, making things happen. The man controls the film fantasy and also emerges as the representative of power in a further sense, as the bearer of the look of the spectator, transferring it behind the screen to neutralize the extra-diegetic tendencies represented by women as spectacle. This is made possible through the process set in motion by structuring the film around a main controlling figure with whom the spectator can identify. As the spectator identifies with the main male protagonist, he projects his look onto that of his leg, his screen surrogate, so that the power of the male protagonist as he controls events coincides with the active power of the erotic look, both giving a satisfying sense of omnipotence. A male movie star's glamorous characteristics are thus not those of the erotic object of the gaze, but those of the more perfect, more complete, more powerful ideal ego conceived in the original moment of recognition in front of the mirror. The character in the story can make things happen and control events better than the spectator, just as the image in the mirror was more in control of motor coordination. In contrast to women as icon, the active male figure, the ego ideal of the identification process, demands a three-dimensional space corresponding to that of the mirror recognition, in which the alienated subject internalized his own representations of this imaginary existence. He is a figure in a landscape. Here, the function of the film is to reproduce as accurately as possible the so-called natural conditions of human perception. Camera technology, as exemplified by deep focus in particular, and camera movements, determined by the action of the protagonist, combined with invisible editing, demanded by realism, all tend to blur the limits of screen space. The male protagonist is free to command the stage, a stage of spatial illusion in which he articulates the look and creates the action. In psychoanalytic terms, the female figure poses a deeper problem. She also connotes something that the look continually circles around but disavows, her lack of a penis implying a threat of castration and hence unpleasure. Ultimately, the meaning of woman is sexual difference, the absence of the penis as visually ascertainable, the material evidence on which is based the castration complex, essential for the organization of entrance to the symbolic order and the law of the father. Thus, the woman as icon, displayed for the gaze and enjoyment of men, the active controllers of the look, always threatens to evoke the anxiety it originally signified. The male unconscious has two avenues of escape from this castration: anxiety, preoccupation with the re-enchantment of the original trauma, counterbalanced by the devaluation, punishment, or saving of the guilty object, or else complete disavowal of castration by the substitution of a fetish object or turning the represented figure into a fetish so that it becomes reassuring rather than dangerous, hence the overvaluation and the cult of the female star. This second avenue, fetishistic scopophilia, builds up the physical beauty of the object, transforming it into something satisfying in itself. The first avenue, voyeurism, on the contrary, has association with sadism. Pleasure lies in ascertaining guilt, immediately associated with castration, asserting control, and subjecting the guilty person through punishment or forgiveness. This sadistic side fits in well with narrative. Sadism demands a story, depends on making something happen, forcing a change in another person, a battle of will and strength, victory, defeat, all occurring in a linear time with a beginning and an end. Fetishistic scopophilia, on the other hand, can exist outside linear time as the erotic instinct focused on look alone. This complex interaction of looks is specific to film. The first blow against the monolithic accumulation of traditional film conventions, already undertaken by radical filmmakers, is to free the look of the camera into its materiality in time and space, and the look of the audience into dialectics, passionate detachment. There is no doubt that this destroys the satisfaction, pleasure, and privilege of the invisible guest, and highlights how film has depended on voyeuristic active-passive mechanisms. Women, whose image has continually been stolen and used for this end, cannot view the decline of the traditional film form with anything much more than sentimental regret.